They were never just legends. The giants in the Old Testament were real, and the Bible never hid this fact. The problem is that many churches prefer to ignore it, and most Christians have never heard a single sermon about the Nephilim. But why? Because once you understand who they really were and what the book of Enoch reveals about them, everything changes. Your view of history, spiritual warfare, and even the end times. What few dare to say is that the Nephilim didn't vanish. They simply changed strategy. The spiritual corruption that began back in Genesis 6 is still alive today. Only now it disguises itself as ideology, technology, and even alternative spirituality. Have you ever felt that something is deeply wrong with the world, but you just couldn't put your finger on it? The answer may lie in these ancient and hidden texts. The Bible and Enoch reveal more than stories. They expose a secret plan of spiritual rebellion that still shapes decisions, dominates cultures, and even influences modern thinking. Understanding who these giants in the Old Testament really were is more than a curiosity. It's a spiritual key, a key that allows you to see where the enemy is still operating and how to protect yourself. So if you want to discover why the Nephilim are still relevant, what the Bible and Enoch actually say about them, and how this can open your eyes to spiritual realities that few are aware of, watch until the end. But be warned, after this, you will never read the Bible the same way again. The accounts in Genesis 6 stir more than mere curiosity. They spark a spiritual alert. Who were the sons of God that took for themselves the daughters of men? This isn't a biblical romance. It's a cosmic boundary being shattered. Celestial beings with powers beyond human understanding crossed a line that was never meant to be crossed. The result? An unnatural birth that still echoes throughout the spiritual history of mankind. These hybrids, known as Nephilim, weren't just tall in stature. They carried an essence that corrupted everything around them. They embodied a genetic and spiritual rebellion. The impact was immediate. An era of violence, idolatry, perversion, and chaos overtook the earth. The world became a distorted field where humanity, already fragile, lost its way even more. And this corrupted mixture still echoes today in less visible but equally dangerous forms. It's interesting how pop culture tries to normalize this idea. Series, movies, and books portray hybrids as heroes. But the Bible shows the opposite. They were symbols of deep corruption in God's creation. It's as if today we're romantically embracing what actually destroys us spiritually, like someone clinging to a seemingly harmless addiction, unaware they're submitting to what has been condemned since ancient times. And here's the warning: when spiritual boundaries are crossed, consequences inevitably follow. Many ignore this, but the nature of that rebellion didn't end with the flood. The seed planted by the sons of God keeps growing in unexpected places. But to understand how this story unfolded and how it connects to hidden knowledge still affecting the world today, we need to look at a book that stood at the edge of Scripture, the Book of Enoch. The Book of Enoch takes us to a nearly cinematic scene. 200 angels, led by Semjaza, descend upon Mount Hermon. There, they seal a pact, not with God, but among themselves, to take human women as wives. This choice altered the course of spiritual history for mankind. They not only crossed the boundary between heaven and earth, but also decided to teach humanity secrets that were never authorized by God. A pact of rebellion that turned the world into a field of spiritual distortion. These watchers didn't come with holy intentions. They taught forbidden sciences, genetic manipulation, enchantments, and the art of war. magic, astrology, seduction, all were given as a dark gift to humanity. And look around, it's not so different from what we see today. How many are being seduced by seemingly harmless knowledge, like certain forms of spirituality, esoteric practices, or even distorted uses of artificial intelligence? This corrupted knowledge birthed giants that were more than physical. They were spiritually degenerate. Knowledge, when disconnected from the divine source, becomes a weapon of destruction. That's why it's so important to filter what we consume, what we learn, and what we teach others. A useful exercise is to review what you're absorbing. Books, films, music, everything carries a frequency. Is it elevating your spirit or slowly corrupting your soul? The scariest part is realizing it all began with a single decision: to cross a sacred line. The Watchers chose disobedience, and the world reaped the consequences of that rebellion. But the story doesn't stop here. Heaven then intervenes. God prepares a response that not only confronts the Watchers, but redefines the destiny of humanity. And that's exactly where the figure of Noah comes in, and the reason behind the greatest judgment in history. Among all the men on earth, Noah stood out, not for being perfect, but for being pure. And here, purity goes far beyond morality. It refers to spiritual and genetic integrity. In the midst of a generation corrupted by fallen beings and hybrid lineages, he remained faithful to God's original purpose. His life became a living ark, a sanctuary of divine order in a disfigured world. God chose him because he still preserved something almost no one else had: the essence of the Creator. The flood, then, wasn't just a heavy rain. It was heaven's strategic response to a corruption that threatened all of creation. Picture a body infected by an incurable virus, and the only solution is to reboot the system. That's exactly what God did. He cleansed the earth, not out of cruelty, but out of mercy. The human DNA was being rewritten by rebellious spiritual forces, and without intervention, no redemption would be possible. But even with this intervention, not everything ended. The Watchers were indeed imprisoned in dark abysses, a severe yet just judgment. However, the influence of the Nephilim, somehow, it survived. How? In some way, the spiritual and perhaps even genetic contamination persisted in certain peoples. And this raises a troubling question. Evil adapts, disguises itself, but does not disappear easily. The spirit of rebellion continues to operate, only in new forms, and it's right after the flood that the story takes a new turn, with entire nations emerging as heirs to this dark legacy. The setting changes, the names change, but the giants still walk among men. Peoples like the Anakim, Rephaim, and Emim are clear examples of this. And when the Israelites arrive at the Promised Land, they don't just find nations, they find colossi. The war wasn't just territorial, it was spiritual, ancestral, and deeply tied to the origin of the Nephilim. When the spies sent by Moses returned from the Promised Land, they brought back a terrifying report. It wasn't just a strong people who lived there, they were giants. We seemed like grasshoppers in their eyes, they said. These weren't ordinary enemies. They were descendants of the Nephilim, known by different names: Anakim, Rephaim, Emim. Entire nations carried the mark of ancient corruption, and their presence posed a threat to the continuity of God's plan for Israel. One of the most striking examples is Og, king of Bashan, a colossus over 13 feet tall. His iron bed is mentioned in the Bible not as a random detail, but as historical evidence that these beings truly existed. Picture a man with superhuman strength, leading a spiritually contaminated people. Ignoring this presence was impossible, And that's why God commanded something radical, that these peoples be completely eradicated, not out of hatred, but as spiritual protection. This point troubles many people. How could a God of love command something so extreme? But once you understand that these nations carried not just culture, but a corrupted essence, the picture shifts. It was like removing a root of poison before it contaminated the entire land. Israel's mission was not just to conquer territory, it was to restore divine order in a world still bearing the scars of the Watchers' rebellion. This was spiritual warfare in its rawest form. And this war, though it may seem like something of the past, continues in different forms today. What now looks like ideology, entertainment, or technological progress often carries the same spirit that drove the ancient giants. The fight was never just against flesh and blood. And when Jesus compared the days of Noah with the days of the end, he wasn't being poetic. He was warning us that ancient patterns are returning with a new disguise. But what does that mean practically for our times? When Jesus said, "As it was in the days of Noah, so it will be at the coming of the Son of Man," he wasn't speaking metaphorically, he was being literal. In Noah's time, there was moral decay, rampant violence, genetic hybridization, and total disregard for divine laws. And today, we see science flirting with DNA manipulation, crossbreeding species, and even attempting to create life in laboratories. We are repeating an ancient cycle, only now with modern technology and presentation. The Tower of Babel today isn't made of bricks, but of data, networks, and algorithms. Humanity, once again, seeks to become like gods, crossing limits without considering spiritual consequences. We see it in online culture, ego worship, and the trivialization of the sacred. It's no wonder so many feel empty, even when surrounded by information and entertainment. Just like in Noah's days, we're trying to build a world without God, and the results are starting to show. The spirit of the Nephilim doesn't need a giant body to operate. It manifests in attitudes, systems, and mindsets. Unchecked pride, technology used to dominate instead of serve, and distorted spirituality, all are remnants of the same rebellion. Here's a practical tip. Examine your digital routine. What kind of content are you consuming? Does it draw you closer to God or push you further away? Set aside daily time to disconnect from the world and reconnect with the Word. Those who recognize the parallels between past and present begin to see that we are in the midst of a spiritual battlefield. And more than ever, the war is for the soul. The ancient rebellion has returned, now wearing new masks, seductive ideologies, science without ethics, religiosity without divine presence. And the demons, the ones that came from the dead bodies of the Nephilim, they're still active. And that's the next veil we need to lift. Few people know, but the book of Enoch brings a shocking revelation. The demons that torment the world today are, in fact, the spirits of dead giants, the Nephilim. They have no place in heaven and no rest in hell. They wander, starving for habitation, craving expression, seeking vulnerable bodies to continue their rebellion. These are beings in torment, trapped between two realms, carrying hatred for humanity and a thirst for vengeance against everything that bears God's image. These wandering spirits are described as impure, hostile, and completely disconnected from the light of God. They operate through cracks in traumas, addictions, grudges, and hidden pacts. That's why seemingly innocent practices like certain games, music, or even meditation techniques can open dangerous doors. Possession, in such cases, is just the tip of the iceberg. The influence starts subtly in thoughts, emotions, and then manifests in attitudes and behaviors. This is why we must remain spiritually vigilant. The battle isn't just fought on altars or in temples, it unfolds in daily choices, in what enters through our eyes, ears, and heart. If you're feeling constant oppression, unexplained anxiety, or recurring destructive patterns, it might be time for a deep spiritual checkup. Readings like the Book of Enoch, Jude, and Ephesians 6 can open your eyes to invisible dimensions. These demons are no myth. They are the spiritual remains of an age that dared to defy the Creator. And if they once acted in flesh and bone, today they operate in emotional, mental, and spiritual realms. The good news? There is a higher authority. Jesus has defeated all these forces and gave us spiritual weapons to resist. But to use them, we must understand where these spirits come from, how they act, and what that means for the days to come. Now that you know the true story behind the Nephilim, the Watchers, the giants in the Old Testament, and the revelations of the Book of Enoch, the real question is, what will you do with this knowledge? Will you just watch and move on, like nothing has changed? Or will you begin to see the world with spiritual eyes, discerning what used to go unnoticed? Have you realized how many strange things happening today connect to the days of Noah? And if those ancient spirits